Hello, economics, and welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 8. We are going to be talking about market failure. But before we get into all of that, I want to talk about the next two lessons. Lesson 8 and 9 are last two in this unit because they're dealing with failures. We've talked about how the economy is supposed to work, right? How markets, in particular, is what we've been talking about here, how markets are supposed to work. We've talked about perfect competition. We've talked about markets that are not perfect competition, such as a monopoly. But these next two, this one about market failure and the next one about government failure, are going to look at what happens when the markets fail. We've already hinted at some of these things, but we're going to take a full look at them now. To kind of set the stage for what some of these failures may look like, I want to tell you about a lake in upstate New York, Brook Trout Lake, right? And as its name suggests, Brook Trout Lake was once teeming with fish, in particular, brook trout. In the 1980s, the fish all died as a result of acid rain. The acid rain was caused by pollution from power plants located as far away as Chicago and Cleveland. The power plant spewed sulfur dioxide into the air, and when it rained, the sulfur dioxide mixed with water to create sulfuric acid, a sulfuric acid concoction known as acid rain. The acid rain fell down on Brook Trout Lake and large parts of the northeastern United States, harming the environment. The people who came to the lake to fish, swim, and boat suffered as a result of the pollution. Although there would be no pollution in an ideal world, society wouldn't want to do away with businesses, I should say, and activities that cause pollution because almost all manufacturing, motorized transportation, and construction creates pollution. And the benefits of some pollution exceed the costs. Without some pollution, we could have no schools, hospitals, cars, or computers. The market forces of supply and demand can bring about too much pollution, however, because pollution causes problems for people who are not involved in the decisions to buy or sell the products that cause that pollution. The power plants did not compensate the people who visited Brook Trout Lake in northeastern New York, or in upstate New York, I should say, for their lost recreational opportunities or pay a price for the damage acid rain caused to trees and buildings. The Brook Trout Lake story has a happy ending for the fish and people who want to enjoy the lake. In 1990, the government tightened restrictions on sulfur dioxide emissions for power plants in the Midwest. It did this by using economics. The plants were required to pay for the sulfur dioxide they produced. This policy encouraged the firms to use technology that produced less pollution. In 2006, trout were reintroduced into Brook Trout Lake, and so far they are doing well. The story illustrates what economists call a negative externality, or an undesirable spillover from the decisions of some people that affects the well-being of others. This lesson explains how externalities, among other problems, cause markets to fail to achieve the best outcome for society. We will then learn in our next lesson how the government can guide markets toward better outcomes, and we will learn some reasons why the government might fail to produce the best result as well. So now let's focus specifically on market failures. And again, government failures will be lesson 9. Market outcomes can be evaluated along two lines: efficiency and equity. As we learned back in Unit 1, efficiency has to do with getting the most out of available resources. A market is efficient if no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. Think back to our production possibility frontier. We then talked about equity as the quality of being fair and just. An economy can be efficient without being fair. For example, if Ebenezer Scrooge owned all the goods in the economy and everyone else lived in poverty, this unfair allocation could nevertheless be efficient if there were no opportunities to make someone better off without making someone else worse off, including Ebenezer Scrooge. There are several paths to efficiency under the right conditions. For example, in Unit 2, we saw that both perfect competition and perfect price discrimination, remember that is the practice of charging each consumer his or her reservation price, those result in an efficient allocation of resources. This is true even though monopolists capture all the gains from trade with perfect price discrimination, while firms earn no profit in the long run under perfect competition. But under the wrong conditions, even these paths don't lead to efficiency due to market failure. So, our key idea for this lesson, Lesson 8. Market outcomes can be inefficient if there are spillover effects from the production or use of goods, if some consumers cannot be excluded from consuming a good, if information is imperfect, or if firms have market power. And our learning objectives, we should be able to define market failure at the end of this lesson. We should also be able to explain the concepts of public goods, externalities, and imperfect information. And lastly, we should be able to identify possible solutions to the sources of market failure. All right, let's get into it. Efficiency and market failure. Why should you care about efficiency? Because in an inefficient market, it is possible to make someone better off without making anyone worse off. For example, if the Ebenezer Scrooge style market is inefficient, it would be possible to make Bob Cratchit better off without making Ebenezer or anyone else worse off. If someone can be made better off without harming anyone else, society has missed an opportunity to improve the well-being of its members. If a market is inefficient, in principle, it is possible to make everyone better off. Remedies may initially make some firms or consumers worse off, even if society as a whole is better off. But inefficiency exists only if the gains from shifting to an efficient outcome exceed the losses. Some of the gains from efficiency could be used to compensate those who don't benefit from the change, making it a win-win situation. Suppose there is an inefficiently small quantity of solar panels because each one costs $500 more to install than it saves on electricity bills. But each panel prevents $1,000 worth of pollution damage. A $501 government subsidy for each solar panel, paid with a tax on the beneficiaries of cleaner air, would make society better off by, this is the math, $1,000 minus 501 equals $499 per panel. And consumers are better off because we take that subsidy of $501, we minus the cost of the panel, $500, which means that we have a cost to the consumer of $1 per panel. That is a win-win situation. This lesson considers reasons why a market left to its own devices might miss opportunities to make someone better off without harming anyone. The inability to achieve an efficient market outcome is known as market failure. We've already seen that market power, the ability of individual firms to set prices, can cause market failure. Our previous lesson explained, for example, that a monopoly is inefficient because the price charged to consumers is greater than the firm's marginal cost of production, meaning that additional units could be made for less than their value to customers. The exercise of market power is one cause of market failure, but there are others. Private goods and public goods. Most of the goods that you encounter every day, breakfast cereal, gym shorts, mystery books, and so on, are private goods. Private goods can be used by only one person at a time. In fact, private goods are so common that we usually just call them goods, without mentioning that they're private. You'd probably take it for granted that if you buy a bike helmet, a necklace, or a calculator, you will be the only user of it. Even if you lend it to a friend, it's still a private good because only one person can use it at a time. Private goods have two defining qualities. They are excludable and rival. If a good is excludable, it is possible to prevent others from consuming it. The owner of a private good, such as a waffle, can prevent other people from consuming that particular good. The enforcement of laws makes many goods excludable. If someone tries to use your bike without permission, you can call the police and have them arrested for theft. To prevent others from eating your waffle, you may need to run fast or eat in the closet. A good is rival if one person's consumption of the good makes it impossible for others to consume it at the same time. For example, if I eat your waffle, you can't because it's all gone. Keep your eyes on your ego. Lego my ego, as the slogan goes for that product. A public good is the opposite of a private good. It is neither excludable nor rival. For example, a forecast from the National Weather Service is a public good. Each day, the National Weather Service makes forecasts about weather conditions in every part of the country. If you look up the weather forecast for your region at the service's webpage, www.nws.noaa.gov, in case you want to do that, you do not reduce the opportunity for someone else to look up the same forecast. For this reason, weather forecasts are non-rival. There is no limit on the number of people who can consume the same weather forecast at the same time. In addition, weather forecasts are not excludable because once they are announced, anyone can use them. Other examples of public goods include national defense, police and fire protection, public radio, global positioning satellite, we know that is GPS, and street signs. Weather forecasts on public radio are pure public goods because they remain non-excludable and non-rival. But most public goods do become rival at some point. For example, one fire station's crew can be on the alert to serve hundreds of residents and has plenty of trucks and water to save your house if it catches fire. But if all the houses on your block caught fire at the same time, the station's resources would be stretched pretty thin. Likewise, parks and roads are public goods when they are uncongested and open to all, but become rival when enough people use them at the same time. In some cases, it is also possible to exclude people from enjoying a public good. Parks can be fenced and roads can be barricaded to shut users out. In Obion County, Tennessee, fire protection extends only to households that have paid the $75 annual fee for it. Others are left to fend for themselves if their house catches fire. Despite a few exceptions and qualifications, the distinction between public and private goods is a useful one. All right. Did you get it? What is the difference between a public and a private good? Go ahead and see if you can answer that. Pause our lecture. See if you can answer that. All right, welcome back. Let's continue on. Private goods and public goods. The under-provision of public goods. From the standpoint of economic efficiency, public goods pose a problem. Firms have little incentive to supply them because consumers have little incentive to pay for them. The market will thus provide an inefficiently small quantity of public goods. Suppose you wanted to start a business that installed street signs. Although many people would benefit from additional street signs, and their combined willingness to pay for these signs might exceed your marginal cost of installing them, it is difficult to get anyone to pay for a street sign because of what is called the free rider problem. The free rider problem is that people consume public goods without paying for them, and this destroys market incentives for firms to provide public goods. Since you can't exclude anyone from reading a street sign, consumers have an incentive to benefit from that public good without paying for it. Even if some people pay for public goods, not everyone will, and the market will provide too few. If everyone free rides, then the public good will not be provided at all. That is a serious market failure. Imagine a city without street signs or police protection. All right, did you get it? What is the free rider problem, and why are public goods underprovided? Go ahead and take a moment to pause and answer that question. Welcome back from your pause, and we will continue. Private goods and public goods, the drop in the bucket problem. The free rider problem is worse when there are many consumers of a public good and the required contribution of each consumer is tiny. That is, just a drop in the bucket, compared with the total cost of providing it. If only a few people consume a public good, then each person might be embarrassed by not contributing something toward its provision. If there are many anonymous consumers, however, it is harder to collect from each one. The drop in the bucket problem arises when no one person's payment is essential, which diminishes each person's incentive to contribute. Suppose your community wants to erect a new statue of a local hero using donations from community members. The statue will go in a square that is open to the public, so enjoyment of the statue will be non-excludable. Since many people can gaze at a statue at once, it will also be non-rival. In a small community with only a few members, the financial contribution of each member would clearly be important, and attempts to free ride would be obvious. But if the community has tens of thousands of members, each feels more anonymous, giving rise to the drop in the bucket problem. Even people who would receive great pleasure from the statue would be tempted not to contribute to its cost. With the tens of thousands of potential donors, it seems that one more donation would make little difference. The free rider and drop in the bucket problems have many applications. Suppose your teacher offered to give every student in the class an A. Wouldn't that be nice? If at least half of the students in the class handed in an extra homework assignment. Each student would have an incentive to free ride, hoping that the other students would do the extra homework. The incentive to free ride would be stronger in a larger class than in a smaller one, because with more people involved, each person's contribution has less effect, and it is easier to be anonymous. How do you think the students' incentives for free riding would change if the teacher promised an A to every student if only one student handed in the homework, as opposed to half of the students? Did you get it? What is the drop in the bucket problem? How does it worsen the under provision of a public good? All right, so take a moment to answer that question. And we are ready to continue. Private goods and public goods. Providing public goods. Because of the free rider problem, the task of providing public goods usually falls to the government. The most obvious technique is for the government to purchase them directly. For example, the largest single item in the federal government's budget is national defense, a public good. In 2010, the U.S. government spent more than $660 billion, that's about one in every $5 it spent, on national defense. Other public goods supported at least partly by the federal government include the National Weather Service, National Public Radio, the national parks, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. State and local governments also provide public goods such as police and fire protection, roads, street signs, parks, life guides at public beaches and swimming pools, and voting booths around election time. In some cases, the government subsidizes the private sector to provide public goods. For example, citizens can receive a tax break if they make a contribution to an eligible charity, because many charities, like the Red Cross, provide public goods. The government can also ensure the provision of a public good by allowing a private party to make it excludable. For example, free riding on the use of a park could be prevented by granting a private firm the right to charge admission and exclude anyone who doesn't pay. Some states have turned over their highways, another public good, to private firms that collect tolls from drivers who use the highways. If you write a song, copyright protection keeps others from using it to make money without your permission. The government grants copyrights to make songs, books, artwork, photographs, and other creations excludable. Patents serve a similar purpose for inventions, such as pharmaceutical drugs. If creations and inventions were not excludable, the free rider problem would result in too few of them, because the incentive to innovate and create new products would be diminished. Did you get it? What are 3 methods used by the government to help make public goods available? Why does the government provide public goods? All right, so go ahead and pause and answer that question. All right, let us continue. One more part about private goods and public goods, and that is the tragedy of the commons. A common is an area of land that is open for members of the community to use. For example, the Boston Common is a 50-acre park once used by many families as a cow pasture. A problem arose at the Boston Common, as is common at commons around the world, because farmers bought too many cows and the land was overgrazed. Open access makes the common non-excludable, but unlike a public good, it is rival because there is only so much grass for the cows to eat. The tragedy of the commons refers to the problem that non-excludable but rival goods become overused. Consider ocean fishing. In many parts of the ocean, it is difficult to prevent people from catching fish, so the fish are non-excludable. But if you catch a fish, no one else can, so fish are rival. Individual fishers have little incentive to limit their catch because each fisher receives the full benefit of the fish in his or her net. But the damage from overfishing is shared by fishers around the world. The result of this tragedy of the commons is that more than 1/4 of the world's fish stocks are harvested more rapidly than they can reproduce. Similar problems arise in regard to logging in national parks, littering in public restrooms, irrigating farms with river water, and emitting car exhaust into the air. I want us to take a closer look at this problem. Here we have a picture of something I do not eat. This is caviar from the beluga species of sturgeon. And this is an excellent example. I mentioned just a moment ago the general problem of fishing in our oceans, but here is a much more specific problem that has to do with fishing and caviar. So, caviar, which is fish eggs, is a delicacy to many consumers. The most highly prized caviar comes from the beluga species of sturgeon. The largest supply of sturgeon is in the Caspian Sea, a body of water between Europe and Asia, bordered by Russia, Iran, and Kazakhstan, among other countries. A good day's catch of sturgeon could sell for $50,000, which exceeds the lifetime income of many people in the region. Not surprisingly, the Caspian Sea attracts many sturgeon fishermen, even though it is illegal to catch sturgeon because they are threatened with extinction. As sturgeon becomes scarcer, prices rise, giving fishermen a stronger incentive to overfish sturgeon. To make matters worse, the large size of the Caspian Sea makes exclusion a real challenge. Attempts to enforce the ban are further hindered by corruption, with fishermen bribing the police to allow them to fish. You might say the problem is one of overfishing the commons. Each individual fisherman has an incentive to catch as many sturgeon as possible, even though the fishermen's collective actions are causing the species to go extinct. As a result of this tragedy, beluga caviar may become a thing of the past. Let's move on. Now, we've talked about public and private goods. Now we're going to talk about another market failure, and those are externalities. If you've ever been helped or harmed by someone else's decision, you've experienced an externality. An externality is any effect felt beyond those whose decisions caused the effect. For example, suppose the Anaheim Steel Company contracts with Disneyland to provide steel beams for a new amusement ride. Suppose further that in the process of producing the steel beams, the Anaheim Steel Company releases pollution into the air. The pollution creates a negative externality for people who breathe the polluted air, because they were not involved in the decision to produce the steel and pollute the air. Other sources of negative externalities include disruptions to the class when one student misbehaves, secondhand smoke, and greenhouse gases released by the burning of fossil fuels. In each of these cases, people are harmed by decisions they didn't make. In the case of the misbehaving student, when weighing the costs and benefits of acting up, the class clown might consider the likelihood of detention and a phone call home, but probably doesn't include the cost of slowing your progress or distracting the teacher. An externality can be positive as well as negative. A positive externality occurs, for example, if your neighbors put a fresh coat of paint on their house. This makes it more pleasant to look at. Although you were not involved in the decision to paint their house, it makes you better off because you get to see a freshly painted house when you look out your window. In addition, it may also increase the value of your house as the neighborhood looks well kept. On the other hand, if they decide to fill their front yard with piles of junk, you may have a negative externality to deal with, depending on your tastes. Because externalities can be positive or negative, you can see them as benefit or cost spillovers that are not taken into account by those causing the spillover effects. For example, when you get a flu shot, health benefits spill over to other people who don't get the flu because they don't catch it from you, creating a positive externality. When you leave sweaty clothes in your locker for 2 weeks, offensive odors spill over to affect other people, causing a negative externality. A competitive market will produce too little of a positive externality and too much of a negative externality. Consider the example of positive externalities from attractively painted houses and negative externalities from ugly ones. Many of those who want to paint their homes an attractive color will decide not to because the cost of repainting exceeds their willingness to pay. But in some of those cases, the benefit to society, including the owner's willingness to pay and the external benefit received by neighbors and passersby who enjoy the view, will exceed the cost. Since the homeowners only consider their own cost and benefit, there will be too few attractively painted homes. Likewise, there will be those with unusual tastes who decide to paint their homes a shocking shade of orange or purple because the cost of repainting is less than the homeowner's willingness to pay. But in some of those cases, the cost to society, including the cost of painting and the cost imposed on shocked neighbors and passerbys, will exceed the benefit. Because the homeowners disregard the cost imposed on others, an excess of purple paint will be splashed around. Did you get it? What is a negative externality and what is a positive externality? Are goods with negative externalities overproduced or underproduced in competitive markets? So go ahead and take a moment to answer those questions. All right, we are back. Let us continue. Solving the externality problem. Taxes and subsidies. Negative externalities cause inefficiency because their cost is not reflected in the amount spent on the associated goods and services. For example, think about what happens when we drive our cars with engines that run on gasoline. The burning of fossil fuel contributes to pollution problems. Our cars contribute to road congestion, and our consumption of gasoline increases the country's dependence on foreign oil. As serious as these problems are, they are externalities because drivers bear only a fraction of the cost. For that reason, drivers tend to travel an inefficiently large number of miles. One way to handle negative externalities is to place a tax on the goods that cause them. The tax can be collected from either firms or consumers, because either way the tax will reduce the quantity of the good that is causing the externality. First, consider a gasoline tax paid by consumers. This is illustrated in the graph on our left. This represents the supply and demand curves for gasoline before the tax. We can see supply, which is not going to change, and demand 1, which is where we are. So supply and demand 1 is where we're going to be before this tax takes place. The equilibrium without a tax occurs at point E1, where the supply and demand curves intersect. Without a tax, the equilibrium price is P1, and the equilibrium quantity is Q1. To reduce gasoline consumption, the government can impose a tax of $1 per gallon that buyers must pay in addition to the price of gasoline. We know that demand 1 shows the most consumers would pay for each gallon of gasoline. The need to pay $1 per gallon in tax to the government decreases the amount consumers are willing to pay firms by $1 per gallon. This shifts the demand curve faced by firms down, or to the left, by $1 to demand 2, our second demand curve. For example, if the most a consumer would pay for the 50th gallon of gasoline is $5, with a $1 tax per gallon, the most a consumer would pay a firm for the 50th gallon is $5 minus that 1. So that means they would pay $4. Right? Because that total is still going to be 5. The supply curve is unchanged because the tax is paid by consumers. The new equilibrium, E2, occurs at a lower price, P2, and a lower quantity, Q2, than before the tax. The after-tax price for consumers is P2, plus the tax of $1. Even though the price paid to firms falls due to the shift in demand, the after-tax price of P2 plus that $1 tax is higher than P1. Note that the burden of the tax is shared by consumers and firms. Consumers pay more than they did before the tax, and firms receive less. Since consumers pay an after-tax price above the original price, and firms receive a price below the original price, the tax decreases both quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. The graph on our right, titled "A Tax on Gasoline Firms," illustrates the situation if the tax is imposed on firms instead of consumers. Supply curve, supply 1, shows the smallest amount of money firms would accept for each gallon. When firms have to pay a $1 tax in addition to their marginal cost for each gallon, the supply curve shifts up, again, to the left by $1. For example, if the marginal cost of producing the 50th gallon of gasoline is $2, with a $1 tax per gallon on top of their marginal cost, the least a firm would accept for the 50th gallon is that $2 plus the $1 tax, for a total of $3. The supply shift causes the equilibrium quantity to fall to Q2, the same quantity that resulted from a tax on consumers. The new equilibrium price for consumers, P2, is the same as the after-tax price paid by consumers in our example when consumers are paying the tax. And the after-tax price that firms receive, price 2 minus that $1 tax, is the same as the price firms received with the tax being paid by the consumer. So the tax on firms has the same effect as the tax on consumers, including the intended result that quantity falls and negative externalities decline. If the tax paid per unit equals the cost of the negative externality per unit, then the price of the good reflects the cost of the good to society, which leads consumers to purchase the efficient quantity of the good. In the United States, the combined federal and state tax on gasoline differs across states, but the average is about 40 cents per gallon. Economists Ian Perry and Kenneth Small estimate that the 40-cent tax is too small compared with the size of the negative externalities caused by gasoline consumption. They advise that the optimal tax to encourage the efficient amount of gasoline consumption, taking account of the negative externalities, would be close to $1 per gallon. Just as the government can prevent negative externalities from causing market failure by taxing goods that are overproduced, the government can promote positive externalities by subsidizing goods that would otherwise be underproduced. When consumers receive a subsidy for purchasing a good, the demand curve shifts upward and the equilibrium quantity increases. Likewise, a subsidy for firms shifts the supply curve downward and increases the equilibrium quantity. That is, downward we mean also to the right. For example, the government subsidizes flu shots, tree seedlings, solar panels, electric cars, education, and the arts, all of which provide positive externalities. All right, so did we get that? Let's check. How can a tax on gasoline help solve the problem of negative externalities from driving? That is, right, we're talking about gas consumption. All right, so take a moment and answer that question. Let us continue. Public goods and private goods, creating a market for negative externalities. We know that when the full cost of a good isn't paid by those who buy or sell that good, the market outcome is inefficient. The goal of taxing negative externalities is to have their costs reflected in the marketplace. Another approach to the same goal is to create a market for negative externalities. One ingenious application of this idea is the creation of tradable permits, each granting the right to emit a particular amount of pollution. Since tradable permits were instituted under the Clean Air Act of 1990, sulfur dioxide emissions have fallen by more than 60%. Here's an example of how tradable permits work. Power plants produce sulfur dioxide as a byproduct of producing electricity. Sulfur dioxide causes acid rain, which erodes buildings and damages the environment. Power plants receive a set number of permits, each allowing the emission of 1 ton of sulfur dioxide. The total amount of sulfur dioxide emissions across all plants is capped by the amount of permits issued. The plants can trade the permits among themselves. For example, if plant A has permits to emit 1,000 tons of sulfur dioxide, but can cut its emissions to 800 tons, it can sell the permits for the remaining 200 tons to plant B, which may be older and thus less able to reduce its emissions. Emissions trading programs provide 3 particular benefits. Number 1, they allow flexibility and creativity. Each firm can reduce emissions in the most feasible and affordable way based on the firm's particular situation. Benefit number 2, they allocate emissions rights to those who value them the most. Newer firms with better systems for emissions reduction can sell their permits to firms that would have a harder time reducing their emissions. And lastly, they provide an incentive to minimize emissions. The ability to sell unused permits gives firms a reason to keep reducing their pollution level even when they are below the level stipulated by regulations. With a market in place for sulfur dioxide emissions, there is no longer an externality. The cost of the pollution to those not involved in the decision is now part of the marginal cost of producing electrical power. As a consequence, if the efficient number of permits is granted, the market does not overproduce sulfur dioxide emissions. The solution of tradable permits has also been applied, for example, to phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment releases into waterways in the United States, carbon dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions in Europe, salt mining in Australia, and car use in Singapore. An alternative to tradable permits is a command and control approach to environmental regulations, which sets out blanket standards for how much sulfur dioxide each plant can emit or what type of equipment each plant can use. Unlike such inflexible regulations, tradable permits harness the power of market incentives to reduce pollution. Firms that develop new ways to reduce emissions save money on their permits, which motivates innovation. Tradable permits yield a higher rate of compliance with pollution reduction goals than command and control standards. And there is evidence that tradable permits have been more cost-effective for the firms involved. Imperfect information. Have you ever paid one price at a shop in a tourist area only to find lower prices for the same thing just a few blocks away? In such cases, a lack of information prevents competition from keeping prices in check. Buyers and sellers must have access to information in order for markets to function efficiently. A problem of asymmetric information arises if one side of a market, either buyers or sellers, has better information than the other. As a classic example, sellers of used cars are better informed about the quality of the cars than the potential buyers. Regardless of their appearance, some cars are good, and others are lemons. That is likely to break down in the near future. If you own a car, you are more likely to put it up for sale if it is a lemon than if it is a dependable vehicle. You are also more likely than the buyer to know whether your car is a lemon or not. How does this information asymmetry affect the used car market? Nobel Prize winning economist George Akerlof examined just this problem in his 1970 article, The Market for Lemons. Akerlof reasoned that the seller of a used car is more likely to know whether it is a lemon than the buyer. This state of affairs should make buyers very wary. If someone wants to sell you a car, and that person knows more about it than you do, you might think that, chances are, he is trying to unload a lemon. Other buyers probably feel the same way and would only buy the car for less than the price of a reliable car. In the extreme, the asymmetric information problem could cause the market to unravel. If buyers refuse to pay the price of a reliable car, only car owners with lemons will offer their cars for sale. Since no one wants to buy a lemon, the whole used car market could shut down. To avoid this type of market failure, lemon laws assist buyers who find that they've purchased a lemon, and reports on the repair and accident history of cars are available to help car shoppers avoid lemons. Asymmetric information also causes market failure when the buyer has better information than the seller. This problem is common in the market for insurance, particularly health insurance, fire insurance, and life insurance. Suppose a health insurance company offered an insurance plan that charged the same price to all buyers. Unfortunately for the company, the people with the worst health and the greatest need for medical expenditures would be the ones most likely to buy the insurance plan. This tendency would hurt the insurance company's ability to earn profit because people in poor health make particularly large health care expenditures. This is a problem of adverse selection. In the insurance market, adverse selection occurs when those with the greatest need for a particular type of insurance are the ones most likely to buy it. More generally, adverse selection arises whenever an individual's decision depends on asymmetric information in a way that places uninformed market participants at a disadvantage. A common solution to the problem of adverse selection in the health insurance industry is to sell insurance to groups of people that are unlikely to be in particularly poor health. For example, most Americans get their health insurance through their place of employment. Because most of the employees in a large business participate in the health insurance plan, the problem of adverse selection is greatly reduced. For those who are not insured as part of a group, perhaps because they are self-employed or unemployed, the problem remains. In these cases, the least healthy are more likely to buy insurance than the healthiest people. The high cost of insuring relatively unhealthy customers necessitates high insurance prices. Because of these high prices, adverse selection makes it more difficult for healthy people to afford insurance. Adverse selection is not a problem in the market for car insurance because the government mandates that every car be insured to some minimum extent against losses from an accident. Both bad drivers and good drivers are required to buy insurance, so there is no adverse selection based on accident risk. In the absence of imperfect information and the other sources of market failure, we can expect markets to be efficient. And here is a summary of the conditions that lead to market efficiency. Number one, rational decision makers are participating in the market, right? Number two, there is perfect competition. Number three, goods that are excludable and rival are being exchanged in an efficient market. There are no externalities, and there is sufficient information. So, did you get it? Explain two ways in which market failure can result from asymmetric information. And with that, we are done with lesson 8. So, go ahead and find concept check for Unit 3, Lesson 8. Work on that, and we will be going over that when we meet. Have a great day.